Okay, I will begin my speech. My topic is centralization and secession. And what I want to do is just apply some elementary economic considerations to modern history in order to come up with some sort of revisionist interpretation of certain events in modern history. The phenomena that I want to discuss, let me just describe them first a little bit. We have all seen the Soviet Union fall apart, and instead of the former Soviet Union, we have now more than a dozen independent states on its territory, and there are still other places that try to become independent of the Soviet Union. Just think of the Chechens. We have seen that Yugoslavia, one of the creations of World War I, has stopped existing, and instead of Yugoslavia we have now Croatia and Slovenia and Serbia and Bosnia and Macedonia. Then we have seen another of these wonderful creations of World War I, Czechoslovakia, also disappearing from the map. Instead we have now the Czechs and the Slovaks separated from each other. There exist Germans and Hungarians in Romania who would like nothing more than be independent. There exist Turks in Bulgaria, and even if we look at Western Europe, there exist independence movements in Scotland, in Northern Ireland. Then in Spain we have the Basques and the Catalans, and then we have German-speaking South Tyroleans in Italy. In Italy also we have a party that some years ago used to be quite influential, lost some of its influence in the meantime. The Lega Nord, that tries to split Italy into Northern Italy and Southern Italy. Then we have in Belgium major conflicts between the French-speaking and the Dutch-speaking parts, with in the meantime a mighty party also pushing for independence, the Vlaams Bloc. And on the other hand, one can say that we have come closer than ever to what one might call a one world order, especially since the fall of the Soviet Union. Since then, of course, only the United States is left over as a genuine superpower, and the United States has domination over Western Europe in particular, and of course also over the Pacific Rim countries, as it is indicated most visibly by the fact that there are plenty of American troops in Europe, especially in Germany, as the loser country of World War II, and in the Pacific, of course, also in Japan as the other evildoer of World War II, and also indicated by the fact that there exists, so to speak, a U.S.-dominated international banking cartel, and the United States currency being used as the international, the U.S. dollar being used as the international reserve currency. And we have tendencies in Europe, such as the European Community and the establishment of the EQ, and similar attempts are, of course, underway in the Asian region as well. Still another aspect of the problem that I want to talk about. Just take a look at history. At the beginning of the millennium, Europe consisted of thousands of independent political units. Until recently, in the 20th century, where only a few dozen or so remain in existence. But there were also decentralizing tendencies. Consider, for instance, the Ottoman Empire, the Turkish Empire, which gradually, from the 16th century on, began to disintegrate until it disappeared, so to speak, with the establishment of modern Turkey shortly after World War I, or take the Austro-Hungarian Empire or the Habsburg Empire from the time of its greatest expansion under Charles V, when that included not only Spain and what we nowadays associate with Austria-Hungary, but of course also large parts of most of South America and so forth, until this Habsburg Empire completely disintegrated and modern teeny tiny Austria was established as a result of World War I. Or as another example of decentralizing, or of the opposite trend, that is, I want to emphasize that the centralizing tendencies in history were stronger, so to speak, than the decentralizing tendencies. Germany is, for instance, a good example of this. In the second half of the 17th century, that is after the 30 Years' War, Germany consisted of some 234 countries, of 51 free cities, and of more than 1,500 independent knightly manors. By the early 19th century, after the Napoleonic War, the number of independent German states fell to about 39, and in 1871 Germany was united, became a single country, and there's a similar history in Italy, also consisted until the end of the 19th century, in the 1860s, of many independent city-states, and was only united to become modern-sized Italy in the 1860s. And even if you look at the smallest, some of the smaller present countries, such as Switzerland, Switzerland becomes only a united state in 1848. It was founded in 1291 as a confederation of 3 teeny cantons, and now it is a central state with some 2 dozen cantons. In fact, on top of this general centralizing tendency, we can also note that there exists, so to speak, an internal centralization within each of these countries. That is to say, the power of the central government shows a tendency to increase as opposed to the power of the provinces, the regions, and the states making up the central states. As an indicator of that, you could look, for instance, at the percentage of taxes that go to the central government as compared to the amount of taxes going to local and regional governments. Now, the standard view is to regard these centralizing tendency as something desirable, as something good, and to consider decentralization or secession as something undesirable or bad. This at least is, so to speak, the view that the victorious forces in history, which are the centralizing forces, try to convey to the public. And what I want to do instead is to show that actually economic theory leads us to consider these or to see these developments with a slightly different eye than what official historians tell us. And in some sense, my objective is to make a plea for secession and decentralization. Now, the implicit assumption of those who see the centralizing tendencies as some progressive tendency in history, the central thesis of those people is quite simple. They basically say greater political units or larger political units, and ultimately, of course, world government means or is equivalent to greater markets, and greater markets produce greater wealth. And in fact, superficially, from a superficial point of view, they have, of course, something going for this argument, because the world has indeed become wealthier from what it used to be in the past. However, from that, it obviously does not follow that centralization was the cause of this increase in wealth that we observe. It might as well be that centralization or that the growth in wealth occurred in spite of the fact of centralization, and that if the centralization had not occurred or not occurred to the extent that it did, that the wealth might be in fact even higher. This is actually what I will try to argue as I go along. Now, what is wrong with this argument that political centralization means larger markets is simply that political centralization, political integration, and economic integration are simply two entirely different things. Political integration or political centralization is simply the territorial expansion of a government's power to tax and regulate its population. On the other hand, economic integration means the expansion and the intensification of the division of labor and of market participants. It has simply nothing to do with political borders whatsoever. And economic integration also means the universalization, so to speak, of a commodity money, the spreading of money throughout the entire world, and the unifying of money into one single commodity money throughout the entire world. Now, in principle, that is, by virtue of the fact that states engage in taxing and in regulating private property owners and market income earners, we can say that political rule is, of course, counterproductive and actually disintegrative of markets. And after all, they punish, so to speak, market participation by taxing incomes that are earned in the market. And we can make a distinction between, on the one hand, productive activities, which are originally appropriating previously unowned goods, producing something out of something that was something more valuable out of what is less valuable, and engaging in mutually beneficial exchange. Those are productive activities. On the other hand, we have, of course, also parasitic or unproductive activities, that is, taking away from those who have originally appropriated goods, taking away from people who have produced something, and interfering with the voluntary exchanges of market participants. This is what governments are famous for, that is, engaging in unproductive activities. The fact that governments sometimes seem to do something good should never confuse us, because in order to do something good, whatever, build a street, build a school, always requires a prior act of parasitic activity before. That is, they must acquire the resources in order to fund the school or build the street through taxation or simply to printing money and so forth. Now, while it is true that in principle, so to speak, all governments are counterproductive, it is also true that in principle, the size of a territory occupied by a government and the degree of economic integration are not directly and systematically related. You can see that simply by, let's say, compare the United States with the former Soviet Union. In the United States, you had, of course, developed internal markets and a high degree of economic integration, so to speak. As compared to the Soviet Union, both countries are big countries, as compared to the Soviet Union, where, due to the fact that all factors of production were owned by the government, division of labor was, so to speak, almost like intra-household division of labor. There were no developed markets and so forth, and we can say that economic integration was very underdeveloped in the Soviet Union. So here we have two large entities. In one you have lots of economic integration, lots of division of labor and so forth. In the other one you don't. Or take small countries, just compare former Albania with former Switzerland. Both countries, again, in this case small. The one shows a highly developed economy with lots of division of labor and integration into the world market, and Albania, again, the opposite, similar to the situation in the Soviet Union. Now, given this, as a general statement, we can say that economic progress would, so to speak, take place if a less taxing and less regulating state expands its territory at the expense of a more taxing and regulating territory, and economic regression or retrogression would take place if the opposite occurs, that is, a country that regulates and taxes more, expanding its territory at the expense of a country that taxes and regulates less. However, despite the fact that there is no systematic relationship between, or no direct relationship between government size or territorial size of a government and economic integration, there exists an important indirect relationship between the size of a state and the degree of economic integration. The reason is the following: all governments must begin small, that is, as local governments or governments ruling over comparatively small-scale territories. It is, so to speak, unthinkable that a government could come into existence from the outset that would rule over the entire globe. And smallness makes for moderation. That is, if there are many immediate competitors that you have, many other neighboring states, then obviously it is comparatively easy also for people to migrate from one place to another. That is, to exit a territory. And of course, emigration, from the point of view of a government, is typically a loss. That is, just if you are in the business of milking your people and the cows are running away, then you are obviously in trouble, especially if the most productive cows, the best milk givers, are running away from you. Just take, for instance, in order to explain, so to speak, how difficult it is for small units to engage in excessive exploitative actions. Just imagine, for instance, a single household, so to speak, as the smallest conceivable independent political unit, and ask yourself, would it be possible, or is it conceivable that a father could do to his son or his daughter what the Soviet Union did to its citizens? That is, to actually deny them all private property in factors of production. And it becomes obvious that if a father would try to do something like this, he would very likely see his son or his daughter run away. Or imagine, would it be possible that the mayor of a small little village could do what governments in the West typically do? That is, take 40 to 50% of their earnings away from them. Would the village population, so to speak, let the mayor get away with something like this? And again, it seems quite clear that he would either have a rebellion on his hands very quickly, or people would simply skip town and move someplace else. Now, this fact, that is, that small political units must be comparatively moderate in their exploitation policies, their taxing and regulation policies, otherwise people will simply run away, is something that historians have pointed out as having played a decisive role in the explanation of why is it that Europe became as wealthy as it is, and the wealthiest region on the entire globe. And what they have said is that Europe owes its economic success to a large extent to the fact that Europe was characterized by what some people have referred to as political anarchy. There never existed a huge central state in Europe in the same way as there existed, for instance, a huge central state in Asia, especially in China. So it is precisely the weakness of governments and the large caused by or affected by the large number of independent political units that is responsible for the so-called economic miracle. Let me just quote to this effect from a French, I think, sociologist, Jean Becheler. He writes in a book, very nice book on the origins of capitalism, the following. The constant expansion of the market, both in extensiveness and in intensity, was a result of an absence of political order extending over the whole of Western Europe. The expansion of capitalism owes its origin and raison d'être to political anarchy. Collectivism and state management have only succeeded in school textbooks. All power tends towards the absolute. If it is not absolute, this is because some kind of limitations have come into play. Those in the position of power at the center ceaselessly try to erode these limitations. They have never succeeded, and for the reason that also seems to me to be tied to the international system. A limitation of power to act externally and the constant threat of foreign assault. These are the two characteristics of a multipolar system, imply that power is also limited internally. So this is Jean Becheler on why political decentralization, political anarchy leads to prosperity. Now, states are, of course, as I explained before, states are, of course, competitors for subjects. They have a monopoly, a territorial monopoly of taxation over certain areas. They like to lose, they dislike to lose population and would like to add population in order to have a larger tax base. And because of this, states tend to come into conflict with each other. I explained in one of my other lectures that, again, from the very nature of a state, states tend to be aggressive because they can externalize the cost of going to war, of aggressing against other people onto other people. So states almost necessarily come into conflict with each other, and the conflicts end in wars. And these conflicts that states are in, the wars that they lead, have the effect of, or can be described as eliminative competition. General Motors and Ford can compete against each other conceivably until the end of the days, and both stay in business. But of course, on any given territory, only one monopolist of taxation can exist. So expansion of state territory goes necessarily in hand with certain other states that previously existed must be gradually eliminated. And then the question arises, of course, in this process of eliminative competition, who is the one who tends to win in these wars, and who is the one that tends to lose in these wars? Who will be able to centralize, expand its territory, and who will disappear from the map? Now, in order to explain this, the basic insight is that we have to realize that any type of war that lasts for more than a day or two requires, of course, that there must be a productive population which continues to produce while the government is at war. People who just supply the fighting forces with foodstuff and ammunition and all the rest of it. Wars require resources, and resources only come into existence if you have a productive population. So what we can say then is that that those countries that tax and regulate their population comparatively less will tend to be the very countries that have a more prosperous population on which to parasitically draw when they go to war. Whereas those countries that tax and regulate their population very heavily have a population that is comparatively impoverished, and accordingly they have less to draw on parasitically when they go to war. So we should expect, and this is so to speak some sort of paradox, but in a way an easily understood paradox, we should expect that more liberal states, other things being the same, that is to say, liberal here understood in the classical European sense, nicer states who just treat their population a little bit better, those states precisely have the greatest expansionist urge and generate the greatest expansionist pressure, because they know that they will likely win in these endeavors, whereas oppressive states are happy that they can maintain their internal power that they have, but realize that an attempt to expand will be difficult for them due to the fact that their population is not exactly productive. The example that I always use in this connection is just compare the foreign policy of the Soviet Union with the foreign policy of the United States. The foreign policy of the United States can be easily explained by the fact that, yes, they are, so to speak, one of the most liberal countries in the European sense, and because of this have a very prosperous population, and that allows the American government, again, keep in mind, all governments are, so to speak, aggressively inclined to be the most aggressive country as far as its foreign policy is concerned. On the other hand, the Soviet Union, which was indeed, so to speak, an evil country, ruled by evil people, very impoverished, was very reluctant to try to expand its territories because its leaders realized that the productivity of the Soviet Union was so low that any lengthy, drawn-out war against another sizable opponent would likely end in disaster. Keep in mind that the major territorial gains of the Soviet Union came, of course, because the United States granted them these territorial gains. That is, that they took over all of Central Europe after World War II would not have been possible unless the United States would have agreed to such a thing. In any case, so what we can see then is that frequently in history, political expansion does go hand in hand with economic liberalization. That explains, for instance, why the expansion of European countries, European imperialism, so to speak, was frequently economically progressive. That is, more liberal countries expanded their control over less liberal countries. On the other hand, you can also see that the larger this or the further this concentration process goes on, and that is to say, the smaller the number of political units becomes, the more one approaches the limit of a one-world state, the less reason remains in existence for a state to keep up the good things, that is, to keep up its internal liberalism. And at the end point of having a world state, it is clear that migration, exiting, has no power then anymore. Wherever you go, the same taxation and regulation structure applies. There is no economic motive anymore to move from one place to the next. And that would, of course, from the point of view of the state rulers, mean that why should I now be particularly concerned about people migrating from one place to another? Now I can, of course, increase the amount of taxation and regulation. That is, this good stuff ends the closer you come to the point where one world state comes into existence. And given that with the end of World War I, and even more so with the end of World War II, the United States acquire, so to speak, some sort of hegemony over most of the globe, it is then not an accident that we find that from that time on, that is beginning with World War I up to the present, that we find a drastic increase in the growth of government power, because the centralization is already very far advanced. A drastic increase in the level of taxation and regulation occurs. Now there were also some internal reasons for centralization and government growth that I want to touch upon briefly. The rise of capitalism in Europe and even more so in the United States had also some sort of ideological component, and that was the doctrine of natural rights and of classical liberalism as represented by John Locke, for instance, and the emphasis that they placed on the idea of private property and on having a minimal government and considering government as a danger and so forth. But this doctrine of classical liberalism was weak, in particular on the centralization question. That is, classical liberals have made the error of promoting centralizing tendencies. That was in particular the case, for instance, in Germany, where the liberal forces were almost exclusively in favor of German unification instead of emphasizing the advantages of small political units. And the classical liberals were also weak on the question of democracy versus monarchy. Most of the classical liberals, for instance, because at that time they faced as their main opponent, of course, kings and so forth, thought that in order to promote liberal goals and liberal ideas, they should align their forces with the democratic movement that came into being as a result of the French Revolution in post-revolutionary Europe. And there existed, of course, also some people like Lord Acton who had clear monarchistic tendencies, but the majority of classical liberals somehow were in favor of democracy. Again, I only want to say something very brief about this distinction and try to explain why democracy actually leads to an increase in governmental power over the power exercised by monarchs. under monarchy you have obviously no free entry into the ruler position. Entry into government is, so to speak, closed. Only the king and his children have a chance to exercise this position. No one else can do it. And the king considers himself to be the owner of a territory. He can pass on his position to future generations, and he considers himself to be the owner of the stock of capital that exists on the territory of a country, and because of this has by and large the tendency of wanting to preserve the value of the country in order to pass it on intact to the next generation. And in addition, there exists, so to speak, a clear-cut distinction between the rulers and the ruled. Everybody knows who the ruler is and who the ruled are, and because of that there exists on the part of the ruled resistance against attempts on the part of the king to raise the taxes. Contrast this with democracy. Under democracy, you have no free entry into the government apparatus. Everyone can become the ruler, so to speak. But under democracy, we have no longer anyone who would consider the country his own property. They are only temporary caretakers of the country. They do not own the capital stock of the country. They only own the income that you can draw from the capital stock. So their incentive is, I have to maximize my income in form of taxation and so forth very quickly, even if that goes at the expense of a drop in the value of the capital goods. Let me use an example. I give you a house, and in one case I make you the owner of the house. You can pass it on as inheritance, you can sell it and so forth. And in the other case, I give you the house, but say you are in charge of this house, you can do whatever you want with this house for 4 or 8 years, but you don't own it, you cannot sell it, you cannot determine who will get it in the future. You are just a caretaker of the house. Will you act differently in this situation? And the answer is obviously you will. In one case, as the owner, you will try to preserve the value of the house. In the other case, your interest will be, I have to maximize my income from the house, regardless of what happens to the capital stock. You might put 50 people in the house, even though that means that all the toilets will be overflowing, the plumbing system will break down and all the rest of it. Your income goes up currently, and after 4 years the house might be in complete ruins, so to speak, but that is of no concern to you, because after all you are not the owner of the house. You are just the owner of the current income that can be drawn from it. This is a completely different attitude. This is the attitude that democratic caretakers have in contrast to kings. And of course, the distinction between the rulers and the ruled becomes entirely blurred. As you all know, this statement there, under democracy we all rule ourselves. Such nonsense would be impossible to get over under monarchy. Nobody believes that there. But under democracy, of course, this sort of stuff has a certain minimal amount of plausibility, despite the fact that it is, of course, manifestly untrue. There exist rulers and ruled under democracy just as much as they exist under monarchy. Now, an additional point to show in which way democracy contributed, so to speak, to the growth of government power is just make another analogy to show how democracy promotes, so to speak, income redistribution and growth of government power by using the following example. Assume we would have a world democracy, one man, one woman, one vote on a worldwide scale. Then the prediction that I would make is we will get a Chinese-Indian coalition government, simply by virtue of the numbers. Now imagine what would this Chinese-Indian coalition government do in order to be re-elected the next time. Now what they would do, of course, is just notice that, hey, you guys in Western Europe and you guys in the United States, you have far too many things. And we in poor India and China, of course, we have too little. And of course, it is high time that we do a major redistribution of wealth and income. And this is, of course, precisely also what happened within all of the countries that we know now, when we gradually expanded the franchise to ever larger and larger number of people. That is, the have-nots, so to speak, using the right to vote themselves, the property of those who have more than they do. So this is the internal reason, so to speak, for the growth of government power. Now let me come to the question of what we should make in the light of what I've said so far, of the idea of secession, the decentralizing tendencies that so far have been on the losing end by and large. What would be the economic rationale for secession? Now, initially, of course, secession, the separating of smaller parts from larger parts, means no more than that the control over nationalized wealth is going to a smaller level, but it would still be owned, so to speak, by governments. But even then, the act of secession eliminates a fundamental problem that exists in many places and in many ways in the current world, and that is a problem of forced integration. That is one of the results of this process of centralization. Has been that certain groups superimpose themselves on other groups. The Soviet Union was dominated by the Russians and meant rule of the Russians over large numbers of other ethnicities, language groups, cultural groups, and so forth. And these other groups were to a certain extent justified in complaining about being exploited by the Russians. It was forced integration. The same thing for Yugoslavia. The Slovenes and the Croats complained, for instance, that the central government of Yugoslavia was by and large dominated by Serbs, and that the Serbs were exploiting other groups such as the Croats and the Slovenes, and so forth. If you separate yourselves, then you can no longer blame other people for your own failings. In the Soviet Union, all mistakes that occurred, whatever, in in the Ukraine or in Lithuania or in Estonia and so forth, everything that went wrong could always be blamed on the stupid Russians who do it to us. In Yugoslavia, all mistakes were always blamed on the stupid Serbs. They do it to us. If they would just leave us alone, things would go much better. Now, if you separate, all of a sudden, the only people that are there to blame yourself, to blame, are your own kind. This you have to accept now that the mistakes are homemade mistakes. The Croats can no longer blame the Serbs. The Latvians can no longer blame the Russians. So now they have, so to speak, a reason to learn from their mistakes. Before, they had no reason whatsoever to ever learn anything, because there was always somebody else that you could blame. What would become apparent then is that actually different territories show quite different degree of cultural and economic advancement. And you would have to look to places that are more successful than you and then try to imitate what makes them successful. So competition between political units would immediately increase as soon as we have the session taking place, eliminating the existing forced integration. Let me just, as a side note, also point out that we have, of course, a forced integration also within the United States by examples, for instance, the busing programs, where you just ship kids of one sort to schools composed mostly of kids of a different sort in order to create, so to speak, harmony. But as you all know, of course, these sorts of busing programs produce exactly the opposite of what they were intended to do. They create more hostility among those people that are forced to associate with each other rather than remaining separate from each other. So another example, by the way, of forced integration is what we see going on in the current immigration business. That tons of people flood the United States and Western Europe that are not by the faintest imagination can be considered as being invited or welcome by the people receiving them. They are forced upon the domestic population. If you have smaller political units, then of course this problem also becomes much smaller. That is, each independent unit determines its own admission standard, so to speak. Something that exists to a certain extent today in Switzerland, where the right to become a citizen is not determined by the central government, but by the community into which a person wants to move. Which of course reduces very much this problem of forced integration that we otherwise have in countries where the central government determines immigration policy. Now, everything else then, of course, after the act of the session and the removing of this phenomenon of forced integration, everything else then, of course, depends on what will be the further additional policies that these secessionist governments pursue. That is, everything else depends on the amount of privatization that these governments will allow, and the level of taxation that they impose on their population, and the amount of regulation. that they impose on private property owners, and of course on what sort of foreign policy, what trade policy they will follow. But as I indicated earlier, there is, even though there is no direct, there is an indirect relationship between size and economic integration. Consider again, emigration becomes easier if there are plenty of places to go to. In each one of these small units must be afraid that if they tax too much, regulate too much, the people will simply just disappear from their places, and because of this they are under pressure, so to speak, to adopt a relatively moderate internal policy. In addition, small countries almost necessarily must engage in free trade policies. Look, if the United States would stop trading with the rest of the world, standards of living would of course fall. But the population would not starve. There would be no mass dying of people in the streets taking place if the United States stopped dealing with the rest of the world. But imagine that a place like Monaco or so would just say no trade anymore with the rest of the world. We do radical protectionism. No, that would just take a few days, and half of the poor people in Monaco would be dying in the streets. The smaller the political unit is, the more pressure exists that you adopt free trade policies. The larger the political unit is, the more easily can you get away with pursuing policies that are hostile towards free trade. So in conclusion, then, the session is not an anachronism, especially in light of the fact that we have come closer and closer to the establishment of a one world state. The session is the only hope that we can break the power of the state, and is potentially the most progressive historical force. The goal, instead of creating a one world state, must be instead, even though that is not the ultimate goal, but the intermediate goal must be, we should strive to establish a world that is made up of thousands of independent countries and regions and cantons like Switzerland and Liechtenstein, and then tens of thousands of independent cities like Monaco and San Marino and Andorra and Hong Kong and Singapore and so forth, all of which you realize are of course wealthier than the surrounding bigger territories that exist next to them. And all of these small territories would then almost automatically be economically integrated by free trade, because there is a necessity for these small units to engage in free trade, and most likely also by an international commodity money standard, because it would be almost going back to primitive barter conditions if every one of these small independent, thousands of independent states would have their own money. That is completely out of the question. This would not last very long. The pressure to establish an international money, and of course, due to the lack of power of any one of these small states, an international money that is outside of the control of individual governments, that is an international gold standard. Let me conclude by reading you a quote from greatest writer and poet of Germany, Goethe, who described Germany during the time when it consisted of 39 independent states, and how he explained, so to speak, the superiority of a place such as this as compared to France that was highly centralized. Goethe, in a conversation with some fan in 1828, said this on the desirability of German political unity. He said that, I do not fear that Germany will not be united. She is united. Again, recall, there are 39 states. She is united because the German Thaler and Groschen have the same values throughout the entire empire, and because my suitcase can pass through all, here he makes a mistake, 36 states without being opened. Germany is united in the areas of weights and measures, trade and migration, and 100 similar things. One is mistaken, however, if one thinks that Germany's unity should be expressed in the form of one large capital city, and that this great city might benefit the masses in the same way that it might benefit the development of a few outstanding individuals. A thoughtful Frenchman, I believe Dopin, has drawn up a map regarding the state of culture in France, indicating the higher or lower level of enlightenment in its various departments by lighter or darker colors. There we find, especially in the southern provinces, far away from the capital, some départements painted entirely in black, indicating a complete cultural darkness. Would this be the case if the beautiful France had 10 centers instead of just one, from which light and life radiated? What makes Germany great is her admirable popular culture, which has penetrated all parts of the empire evenly. And is it not the many different princely residences from whence this culture springs, and which are its bearers and curators? Just assume that for centuries only the two capitals of Vienna and Berlin had existed in Germany, or even only a single one. Then I'm wondering what would have happened to the German culture and the widespread prosperity that goes hand in hand with culture. Germany has 20 universities strewn out across the entire empire, more than 100 public libraries, and a similar number of art collections and natural museums. For every prince wanted to attract such beauty and good. Gymnasia and technical and industrial schools exist in abundance. Indeed, there is hardly a German village without its own school. How is it in this regard in France? Furthermore, look at the number of German theaters, which exceed 70. The appreciation of music and song and their performance is nowhere as prevalent as in Germany. Then think about cities such as Dresden, Munich, Stuttgart, Kassel, Braunschweig, Hanover, and similar ones. Think about the energy that these cities represent. Think about the effects they have on neighboring provinces. And ask yourself if all of this would exist if such cities had not been the residences of princes for a long time. Frankfurt, Bremen, Hamburg, Lübeck are large and brilliant, and their impact on the prosperity of Germany is incalculable. Yet, would they remain what they are if they were to lose their independence and be incorporated as provincial cities into one great German empire? I have reason to doubt this. With this, I end. Thank you very much.